Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cole. It's Sunday evening, November 10th, and this will be the announcement for week 13 of Political Science 3753 Con Law for the fall 2024 term. All right, everybody, what we have on the syllabus this week is Religious Freedom, lectures 23 and 24. I have just sent out some material for a discussion later this week, Wednesday and Thursday. That will be discussion 6. And then related to this freedom of religion material, I've also sent material out for quiz 6, which we will take not this week, but next week on the 21st, Thursday the 21st, just before we leave for Thanksgiving. Okay, so with that, we will have gotten in 6 discussions and 6 quizzes. And once we do quiz 6 at the very end of that week, before we take off for Thanksgiving, I will send assignments out for quiz 7 and discussion 7, which we would do when we come back from Thanksgiving, the last week of school. Okay. Let me mention also, everybody, remember looking at the syllabus, we mentioned to you that you didn't have to turn in a term paper, but you do need to turn one in if you wish to be on the A track for the course. In other words, to make an A, you have to turn in a term paper. Okay, you may find it will help your grade in any case. We've got now something like a month, 4 or 5 weeks left of the term, so it's time to start thinking about that. And we'd sent out a list of Supreme Court cases that could be suitable topics, and I'd be happy to correspond with anybody about that through the course website or at my OPSU email, david.cole@opsu.edu. All right, everybody, let's look briefly at what we have in the class notes for lectures 23 and 24. Now, we start out with a look at the Virginia statute for establishing religious freedom going back to 1786, a document in which both Madison and Jefferson had a hand. And so that's something that carries a lot of weight and a lot of clout. Students will be aware that we have a prohibition in the First Amendment against any law respecting an establishment of religion, which often is taken as establishing a separation of church and state or a wall of separation. But remember, that language is that of Thomas Jefferson, which is not in the Constitution itself. What the First Amendment says is no law is respecting an establishment of religion. That's the Establishment Clause, and of course there is the Free Exercise Clause alongside it. So the separationist interpretation carries quite a bit of clout, but it's under pressure. For instance, in the recent election campaign, Mr. Trump has had the support of those who would like the interpretation to be less absolutely separationist, or perhaps the alternative to that would be accommodationist rather than separationist. And the 3 justices that Trump appointed during his first term, Justices Kavanaugh, Barrett, and Gorsuch, have some sympathy for that more accommodationist view. Okay, so this is an issue we're going to see going forward. We expect it to see it come up now in Trump's second term. So that's what we're asking you to discuss later this week on the 13th and 14th. And then we've given you a couple of things to look at going back to 2019 that are related to all this, and we'll take a quiz on that on the 21st before we break for Thanksgiving. Pro and con on whether religious freedom is in danger in America. Those Wall Street Journal essays, articles. Pro and con going back to the year 2019. All right, so the Virginia statute for establishing religious freedom is, of course, highly significant, historically important. Madison and Jefferson inclined to a separationist view. Their own religious views were less orthodox than many of their contemporaries, so we can't be 100% sure that most people in America at that time shared Madison and Jefferson's view, although the Establishment Clause often is taken that way. Now, some of the cases that have come up, West Virginia versus Barnett, 1943, was a case in which the Supreme Court reversed itself from just a couple of years earlier and decided that states such as West Virginia should not be allowed to compel individuals such as Jehovah's Witnesses who objected to saying the Pledge of Allegiance should not be compelled to take part in that ceremony at the beginning of a school day. Justice Felix Frankfurter disagreed, and you'll see in the class notes what he had to say about it. But his view had prevailed a couple of years earlier, but the Supreme Court finally reversed itself in 1943 in the case of West Virginia versus Barnett. Accommodation of religious beliefs. In Wisconsin versus Yoder, the court famously accommodated the preferences of Amish people in Wisconsin, where there was we associate that with Pennsylvania, but there was also a community in Wisconsin, people who did not wish for their children to have to observe the compulsory education laws going into the junior high and high school years, and preferred their kids to receive instead the traditional education that the Amish traditionally had given, in sort of a homeschool type situation to their kids. And the Supreme Court agreed to give the Amish that exception in 1972. So the issue arises, when, if ever, do we grant religious exemptions to generally applicable laws? Now, Employment Division versus Smith was a case in which the Supreme Court drew back on this kind of accommodation. And Congress was alarmed and passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. It was applied in some ways that the authors of the act in the 1990s perhaps did not anticipate, such as the Hobby Lobby case, so-called Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, 2014. So that's some litigation and legislation you want to take a look at closely on the issue of accommodating religious beliefs. The late Justice Scalia was in on the decision in Employment Division versus Smith, and he was concerned. He didn't want anybody to be able to claim a religious exemption to just any law. But we traditionally had granted such exemptions, and so Congress chimed in with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which became an issue almost 20 years later in the Hobby Lobby case. So that'll be something worth mulling over as you look at that in the class notes. Religious displays in government buildings, Christmas decorations. What if they include religious symbols? When is or is not such a thing permitted? The court has gone around and around and around about that through the years, and many scholars are dissatisfied and think that perhaps the court has made a mess out of that. It's a sort of untidy area of constitutional law, but in any case, you'll find that discussed in such cases as Lynch versus Donnelly, 1984, Allegheny County versus the Pittsburgh ACLU in 1989, and other subsequent more recent cases you see there in the class notes going back to 2010 and 2022. All right, that's lecture 23. Now, in lecture 24, we discuss issues that come up with regard to the treatment of religion in public education. And this is something that is quite fraught and controversial, and something where Mr. Trump's supporters want him to move in a more accommodationist direction, and the Supreme Court may end up doing that, especially due perhaps to the influence of the appointees that Trump has put on the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett. Lemon versus Kurtzman, 1971, is an important decision for church-state relations, trying to lay down guidelines, rules for what the government may and may not do in cases in which it is interacting with religious institutions, something the court is backing away from, perhaps. Okay. Jurisdictions through the years have tried to give assistance to private and parochial schools. The court has been skeptical about it traditionally, although they have allowed the provision, the so-called loaning of textbooks, provision of textbooks to private and parochial schools on the basis of the child benefit theory, the idea that the students were being benefited directly. The aid was going not to the school so much as to the students, was the theory. Okay, it's something that has been viewed with a great deal of skepticism. The courts for decades were hesitant to move very far beyond that with regard to government aid to private and parochial schools, but that is something that has come under greater and greater pressure with the passage of time. Okay. There's also the issue of religious instruction and prayers in schools. Okay. The big school prayer decision goes back to Engel versus Vitale, 1962. Something that many people viewed as taking God out of the schools. The state of New York had required that a prayer be recited at the beginning of the school day, a recognition of what we used to call the civil religion of the United States. But the court, going back to the Warren Court period of the 1960s and 70s, moved to restrict the observance of that so-called civil religion, and Engel versus Vitale was a major watershed in that case, and no prayers written by the school authorities to be said in public schools. Now, at a commencement ceremony, the court eventually reached a point which it took some steps to try to accommodate students who wished to offer an invocation or a prayer, say by the valedictorian at a high school graduation ceremony, as long as it's initiated by the student, not the school authorities. The court decided they would go ahead and look the other way at that and permit it. Okay. Now, the direction in which the court has been going lately, they begin to explore the possibility of something that would be more accommodationist and less separationist with regard to religion in the schools and aid to private and parochial schools and private and parochial education. Some of the cases we might refer you to that you see discussed in class notes to lecture 24. Going back to 2002, Zellman versus Simmons-Harris. This, of course, is before Donald Trump and the appointments that he made to the Supreme Court. This is a case in which the court began to search out and explore the terms on which it might permit a so-called voucher plan. The idea that a parent would be given a voucher, one per child of school age, and then you could spend that voucher at a school of your choice, private or public, religious or secular. Okay, so the court tried to lay down some guidelines and rules and regulations for such a thing within the confines and the strictures of the Establishment of Free Exercise Clauses in Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, 2002. You'll see that discussed in the class notes. Now, the Supreme Court under John Roberts and with the Trump appointees, some of the things they've tried to do. Look at the Trinity Lutheran case, 2018. Carson versus Macon, 2022. A couple of these cases were directed at so-called Blaine amendments that many states has enacted going back to the 19th century that were often regarded as bigoted and anti-Catholic in intent. And what the court tried to say in some of these cases is, okay, if a government has got a general program of aid to schools, public and private, you can't exclude schools from programs like that just because they are religious. That's the direction in which the court under Roberts with the Trump appointees is beginning to go. You see that in the Trinity Lutheran case from 2018 and Carson v. Macon, 2022. Also very interesting, something that got a fair amount of publicity regarding a high school football coach who wanted to pray after ball games, Kennedy versus Bremerton, 2022. A case you may have heard of that's discussed at the very end of the class notes for lecture 24. Kennedy versus the Bremerton School District. It was in Washington State from just a couple of years ago, 2022. So those are some cases where the current court is exploring the possibility of a more accommodationist rather than separationist attitude toward the treatment of religion in the schools, and schools that may take a religious rather than secular approach within the confines laid down by the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses of the First Amendment. So, where the court might go on that in years to come, especially in the wake of the recent election, is something that might be a matter of concern to many of us. All right, everybody, so take a look at that material in 23 and 24. Discussion later this week on Wednesday and Thursday, the 13th and 14th. Then a quiz related to this material next week on the 21st before we take off for Thanksgiving. And on top of all that, do be thinking about term papers if you would like to do one. And with all that, we'll be talking to you once again about a week from now at this time. Take it easy.